In 2010, the late Desmond Tutu, Archbishop of Cape Town, embraced football fans of the world by proclaiming, "Welcome home." His point was that 60,000 years ago, humans first left their home of Africa. They have been wandering ever since. Migration is a human habit. We move out of wonder of what is round the corner and out of necessity to escape poverty, war, and persecution. What then has this global perspective got to do with the city of Southampton? My argument is that migration is at the heart of Southampton's past as well as its present. Southampton is a really interesting case because it's not the first place you think of as a migrant city. There is, of course, New York with its welcoming Statue of Liberty. Give me your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Or less encouragingly, Ellis Island, where these wretched refuse will be processed and some returned. If you think of the United Kingdom, again, Southampton may not come to mind first. There is, of course, London, and especially its East End. Here is the mosque that used to be a synagogue, that used to be a Huguenot chapel in 1743. There is Cardiff, and the place of excitement and fear, Tiger Bay. Or even Liverpool, home to the oldest black communities in Europe, and many other migrant groups, most prominently the poor Irish famine victims of the late 19th century. The point I want to make and insist upon is that because Southampton does not immediately come to mind in this top of the migration city charts, is why it's such a good case study. If Southampton is not known in this way, yet can be proved to be a city where migration has defined it, then this is true of elsewhere. And the very denial or ignorance of this migration city status is revealing itself and raises questions of why we do not accept that as human beings and flightless, we still have wings on our feet, despite attempts since the late 19th century to place barriers against movement. So I'm going to give you a tour of the city to try to prove my case. I'll begin with Sam Smith's wonderful automated artwork, Bathers in Southampton Water. Created toward the end of his life, Sam was the son of a steamship captain. As a lad before the First World War, watching the ships go by the Solent, impressed only by the size and numbers of their funnels. Having visited the Ellis Island Museum, he started to wonder who was in these ships, especially the poor migrants below deck. These were, he believed, the real people, fixed in the model as they were as third-class passengers, unable to move, as was the case of those on the Titanic. The memory of the Titanic is central to the story Southampton tells of itself. Not surprisingly so, because many of the drowned were the crew of the ship. It was an immigrant ship, defined as such by the American authorities, and because of their concern about disease, literally locked away from the first and second-class passengers. Like those on Sam Smith's boat, they are hidden away, if still in plain sight. This is part of my theme. Southampton's migrants are there and not there, out of sight but visible if you look. Go to migration museums as far away as Australia or America, and Southampton will feature. It is part of the world of migration heritage, only recognised in Southampton itself with the opening of the Sea City Museum in 2012. In 2020, the Mayflower 400 project reinterpreted the journey of the Pilgrim Fathers as one of migration, in this case of religious refugees fleeing from Britain and to America. A new modest plaque recognises migration, though for some it is unwelcome, and it was instantly defaced with the word bullshit for those rudely rejecting its message. We also have our own Ellis Island, in fact, two versions of it. The first is the Emigrants' home near the docks, constructed in 1893. No coincidence, as it was at the same time as Ellis Island or the emigrant depot in Hamburg. It was opened to stop migrants from Eastern and Central Europe floating around the town of Southampton. The American consul had a big role to play in its opening. It was a form of remote control where immigrants could be inspected before they reached Ellis Island. Tens of thousands of migrants stayed there in Southampton for days or weeks before their ship departed for the new world of the Americas, Africa, or Asia. Yet the foundation stone of the emigrant's home is hidden behind a huge and rather malodorous wheelie bin. Fast forward 30 years, an Atlantic Park hostel was designed to replace it, but in a much more spectacular way. The big shipping companies collaborated to transform what had been an American naval base from the First World War to a place where migrants could be screened before continuing their journeys. American racist immigration quotas in 1921 and 1924 put a stop to this being a viable financial operation. Instead, Atlantic Park became Britain's own Ellis Island, with transmigrants, those who are passing through Britain, stranded there for up to 9 or 10 years. They were unable to go home to lands of persecution, onwards to their favoured destination, America, or to stay in Britain, which in 1919 had passed its own immigration laws that were even more severe than those to follow shortly in the United States. The site and buildings became Southampton Airport in the 1930s. Today, the rebuilt airport has refused so far to recognise its remarkable past as the world's largest transmigrant camp during the 1920s. Perhaps a place where people were delayed for close to a decade is not easily thought of as a usable past for an airport. It's a shame because there was a remarkable world in Atlantic Park Hostel of Yiddish theatre, of Ukrainian children excelling in local schools, and its Irish commandant teaching East European Jews and Christian Mennonites to the joys of playing cricket. As described at the time, it was a veritable little League of Nations. Southampton has thus been part of a history of immigration control, and we can point to racial exclusion more recently, as well as how the medieval Jewish community was removed and banned from settling there in the 13th century before the Jews were expelled. It would be wrong to ignore such traditions, part of the wider myth of fairness that sometimes stops Britain from confronting its own prejudices. There is more, however, to the story than that. There has also been resistance to racism throughout, including the staying power of migrants of all shapes, sizes, religion, and colours who have made a life for themselves and their children. They help shape its economy, politics, culture, and religion. Before there was Southampton, there were those that passed through, like the Stone Age people who left this wonderful polished axe head made of green jadeite. It came from the Alps and was traded across France into Britain up to 6,000 years ago. There were then those who travelled and settled a while with Iron Age sites 3,000 years ago on Southampton Common. There is also the small fort, which is now in a 1960s upmarket housing estate, made visible only through the street name Chilworth Ring. Roman Southampton is similarly nearly invisible. The site of the important port for Winchester, called Clausentum, it's not accessible to the public in Binton Park, in this case recalled only in a street name some miles away. Named Hamwick, at the time, Southampton was one of the most important Saxon towns in England. And the archaeology of its centre, now St Mary's Football Stadium, has been astonishing and varied. Indeed, the city, with its different locations for Roman, Saxon, medieval, and the modern manifestations, is an archaeologist's dream. But that means its riches are literally often hidden under our feet. Hastening Saxon decline were Viking incursions and settlements, including that of King Canute, even if his warning to the sea was more legend than fact. The Normans took over a declining town and rebuilt it in a new space, creating what is now the heart of Southampton's historic quarter, and possessing with the Bargate one of the finest medieval gateways and some of the most extensive city walls. English Street and French Street show how blatantly significant the Norman presence was. Indeed, French would have been the everyday language of the town in medieval times. With more invasions by sea, the town went into decline again and was revived only by a group of Italian merchants, craftsmen and sailors in the 15th century who restored its fortunes. One of their number, one Cristoforo Ambrogi of Florence, as Christopher Ambrose, became mayor of the town in 1486. There is little to remember their presence, but they brought the world to Southampton with fine goods. One of their number employed Jack Francis, an African diver, to salvage the Mary Rose. Francis was the first black man to give evidence to a British court. The Italians left as trade patterns changed, and the town went into decline again. This time, Southampton itself decided to recruit migrants, Protestant refugees who were escaping persecution in the Low Countries in the mid-16th century, becoming as many as 1 in 10 of the population. Their numbers were refreshed by French Huguenots in the late 17th century. In terms of science, industry, and learning, Southampton was revived once more. The pattern should now become clear. Southampton's continuity has not just benefited, but depended on migration for its very existence. Moving finally to the modern period, we cannot do justice to the range of the groups who have come to Southampton. We might mention Venetian Teresa Cornelis, former lover of Casanova, who helped its development as a spa town in the later 18th century. Then there were the Irish who helped build its docks and first railways in the first half of the 19th century, or the African and Asian sailors who manned its ships and were, along with other foreign seamen, part of its everyday life as a thriving port city. We should mention the Jewish, Italian, Greek, German, and other traders who modernized its commercial and shopping facilities from the Victorian era through to the Second World War. With all the attention on the arrival of the Empire Windrush in June 1948, it is forgotten that a similar ship carrying Caribbean migrants arrived in Southampton a year earlier, or more significantly, that its magnificent ocean terminal in the 1950s and 60s was the most important port of arrival from the West Indies. For most Caribbean migrants, Southampton was a place to pass through on the way to Waterloo Station, and more a place of settlement from those from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Its status as a city of sanctuary continues with asylum seekers and refugees settling or being temporarily accommodated in the city. Finally, it has benefited hugely from the arrival since the early 1990s of East Europeans, who represent over 10% of its current population. Today, nearly 1/4 of Southampton's population is born abroad, and there are 55 countries of origin and 150 languages spoken in the city. The 40,000 students at the 2 universities add to its diversity, most of whom come from outside Southampton. If that does not qualify it as a city of migration, it is hard to imagine what would. But I hope I have shown how this is not a modern phenomenon. and that from prehistory to Roman, to Saxon, Viking, Norman and beyond, every critical stage in the history of a place called Southampton, then Hamwick, then Hampton, before it was known as Southampton, has been shaped by migration. Thus, Southampton is a migrant city, and a special one, but it is far from unique. At one point, in a recent or more distant past, we are all migrants. Thank you.